Without further ado, we'll kind of get started with our opening comments. Monica and I are going to tag team this session again like we did last week, and the week before. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, you probably heard my voice enough. Two, Monica's really smart on a lot of these topics, and so it's useful to use her big brain and as we continue to work through this design thinking and the qualitative aspects of the research associated with it and whatnot. So thank you again for joining us. We're really excited to have you here. Today, we are going to get into problem definitions and solutions. It's part 3 of our design thinking series, but again, we believe that these sessions should stand alone and there's value in them that is not required to be a part of the other sessions. That being said, if you are interested, the videos are up on the entire navigation series, but specifically if you're interested, feel free to go back and if you missed 1 or 2, go back and check those out. Well, the first one was on how prototypes can be used at the beginning and the end of the design process. And last week we did almost exclusively focused on qualitative approach, data collection, or empathy, like how empathy is so critical to the data process in anything that you do, but especially in problem solving. Empathy is so very, very important. So what we're going to go into today is, you've collected a bunch of stories, data from individuals that you serve, people experiencing the condition that you're trying to solve, and what do you do now? And really the first part of what we'll do this morning will be Monica talking about different approaches to analyzing that data. And again, like, we get that, as academic researchers, when we wear our academic hat, which is not that as often as it used to be honest with you, but when we wear our academic hat, there's one way we go about qualitative research. What we're really talking about here is applied research. We're talking about how do you get the information you need to make the best decisions you can possibly make. And so the first half of our session today is going to be Monica talking about that. And then we'll transition to, great, so we've analyzed the data. Now, how do we put this into a statement that allows us to create the most possible solutions? If I take a very quick step back and say, why are we talking about design thinking? What's the utility of this approach? To me, it really rests on a couple of kind of pieces that I think are traditionally different than traditional strategic planning. One is there's a huge focus on empathy and user-centered problem solving throughout the process. And whether it's in the research phase or in the problem phase or even in the solution phase, we constantly are reminding ourselves who we're doing this, like the end user. 2, it is the extreme focus on spending time on understanding the problem. So the Kettering quote was in the description for today's session, but there was also in the set, I also oftentimes will, and I'm sure I've said it on this series before, I like the Einstein quote, if given an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes defining it and 5 coming up with the solutions. And it's, again, the idea here is that we want to spend more of our time on defining a problem, and then the solutions will evolve. The solutions will evolve. And those are 2 characteristics of the design thinking approach that we think are particularly valuable. If there's a third, it would be more innovation or more creativity is better than less creativity in a problem solving process. And that's kind of why the problem statement and writing it a specific way matters. And so without any further ado, or with enough from me, I'm going to shift it over, throw it over to my colleague Monica and let her kind of take it from here.
Okay. So like Scott said, we talked last week about qualitative data. We talked about interview data in particular. There are many forms of qualitative data and many, many ways to analyze it. But like Scott was saying, for the purposes of design thinking, we're in the mindset of addressing a problem, creating a solution, and producing some form of product, service, or program for an audience. So with that in mind, we're looking at the human experience and how groups of people interact with their environment. So we're looking for what's missing, what's needed, and what may help. We spoke last week about some approaches, like we said, including ethnographic interviews and observations, which really gets to that human experience. And so this may include notes or observations done with community groups. It may be interviews, it may be video and audio of events or communities. It could be images, it could be text documents that you gather, it could be any number of things. So if you use interview and observation data, then you'll need a systematic way to analyze that data and make sense of it, not only for yourself, but for your team of people who are helping you to develop your problem statement and help you develop your end product. So keep in mind that qualitative data is really susceptible to bias and subjectivity. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I know we mentioned in our last session a little bit about ways to think about who's going to go in and do interviews, who's going to participate in the research as the researchers, as the people conducting interviews. So that's one way, but that's something just to keep in mind as you approach any research, is your positionality. So when doing research, you should take intentional measures to achieve that objectivity as much as possible. That's hard to do sometimes, but as long as you're transparent about your process and you really think that through, maybe bounce it off somebody else, your team members, and just really keep that in mind. That's important. So with that in mind, we want to look at our interviews and observations in a very systematic way. So I'll briefly go over some of the steps that you can take. All of these can be done in a more in-depth manner. Like Scott mentioned, if you were to do like a really in-depth research project or study, these would all take a lot of time individually, but we can really apply them to social settings, to wanting to solve even a small problem all the way to a larger problem in our organization. So these can be applied in a number of different ways, but this is just kind of an outline of some of the steps that you might take once you've done some of those interviews, or if you have other data that you want to go through. So after you've organized all of your data, you'll want to go through and code it, essentially. So coding just really means that you're assigning words or phrases that are representative of what the data is saying to represent themes that come up. So for example, if you were to do interviews or discussions or focus groups with a group of people, and they were sharing that their experiences are feeling disconnected from others physically or emotionally, which seems very applicable right now, and wanting to be more involved in social groups or needing access to the things that they need more easily, a representative code word for that might be something like isolation. Then you'll want to identify patterns. So once you have a handful of themes, you'll want to identify patterns and relationships between those themes. So you might do this by looking at some of those representative words or phrases, or you might do it by comparing groups that are participating, or if you were to do some of your research over time, especially if you're going through the prototyping process, you might compare groups that are experiencing the different prototypes. So ultimately, you'll want to summarize your data. You'll want to know what you're finding and what you can learn from the process. So again, this is not about finding a solution yet, but rather a deeper understanding of what the situation or problem might be. Qualitative approaches, they really allow for the subtleties of unreported behaviors or preferences to come through in those observations and sharing. So when you analyze and summarize your findings, you have options of how to go about this. And some may be a better fit than others, just depending on the data you're working with or the time that you have to put into it, or how rigorous your process is. But one approach is narrative analysis. So this is one way to go about analyzing the data. It would essentially mean that you create representative user or participant profiles or stories of collective responses. So you're essentially creating representations of different experiences and creating them in representative like individuals. So you may have seen this in other areas like brand development. This is a really highly used process for brand development. So you would shape these stories from the data you gathered. You would describe people's life experiences as much as you can, their day-to-day, what that might look like, their family situation, their work situation, et cetera, and create a persona to really help you see who that intended audience person is. So once you've done this, and you can kind of see who these people might be and how they would interact with the product or the service or the program that you're thinking about developing or the problem that you're trying to solve, you can then do a gallery walk of sorts to really see the group. So it may help you truly see visually what you're looking at. So this might be something where you have like a little description and maybe some images, and you have them on a PowerPoint and you go through in slides, or it might be something that you put up on the wall. And as a team, you can walk through and kind of walk the path of the people who might be experiencing what you're trying to understand. So content analysis is another way to go about analyzing your data. It essentially means that you're going to do a more intense categorization of that verbal and behavioral data. So when you do your interviews and you go through and you find common themes and reoccurring words, you're going to do that really in depth to really just get to the core and the meat of what the content is that you've gathered. So you're ultimately looking for identifying and describing those patterns and themes. You can also do framework analysis and grounded theory. These are other things you may have heard of. There are other ways to work through research. These approaches are more involved and usually encompass more data and more time, but they can be really meaningful if you're looking to develop a thematic framework or formulate a theory that would extend to multiple groups maybe over time. So if you read about grounded theory, those are really useful ways to go about things. They usually lend themselves more to human behavior rather than development of a service or a product, like through design thinking, but it's useful in terms of like curriculum development or other areas that impact human and social settings. So depending on your organization, that might be something that at some point is of interest to you. So that's like a really quick look at what some of the steps are. Analysis can be a lot of steps. It doesn't have to be just those. It can include other things. It's typically a lot of reading, a lot of interacting with the groups you're looking to serve, but it really is important because it gets to that human experience you're trying to address. And it also uncovers things that are not directly told to you. So likely not something that would be directly answered if you were to do a survey or you were just to gather demographic data points. So those things can leave you open to a lot of assumptions or unaddressed areas. So they're important. It's important to have those things also. But if you really want to work through the design thinking process and think about things from people's perspective, really getting at the root of the human experience for those that you're looking to serve is really important. So like I said, there's lots of technical ways to go about these steps. Some doing this work will code and find themes by hand, just literally go through transcripts and circle things and make summaries of things. Others will use software. There's software that can help you do this if like your interviews are transcribed or if you have audio of them. So there's software that can help you with that too. So if you had a large number of interviews, that might be something that you wanted to explore. Some will incorporate images or hands-on systems for the discovery work as you're going through the research. So I know when we talked about in prototyping, a lot of times people will use tangible materials. They'll use Post-its, they'll put their ideas out there, they'll stick them all up on the wall and really have something visual in front of them. So this might be something where you develop a process to go through your interview data, for example, and then write out some of those things on Post-its, put them up on the wall, see what's there, and just have that kind of physicality and that interaction with the data. So quantitative data is certainly helpful. It also helps to tell that full story, and it has a unique perspective and purpose. For design thinking, since we're aiming for learning about that human experience, as we said, getting at the feelings, the emotions, and the day-to-day is essential for qualities of empathy and to do useful qualitative work. So like that ethnographic approach we talked about last time. So with all of these steps and ways to go about the process, it's important to remember essentially why you're doing them. So you're seeking to understand and you're wanting to really get at that experience and uncover things you may not otherwise know without this work. You can always use other data, numerical data to supplement and to help support the structure of what you're saying, but this will really help you to get at that human story. And that's all I have, Scott.
Great, thanks, Monica. So we got a couple of questions, Monica, while you were going through some of the content.
Sure.
And one of the things we're going to want to do, it sounds like, is people are interested in a little more detail on some of those like approaches that you were talking about, the narrative approach. So I'd let people know we will get out a little more information on digging into the depth of some of those approaches. I think what's really good about what Monica was saying is what you're really looking for, and she mentioned this kind of right off the bat, is kind of that representative individual. Is that, what was the word choice you used, Monica? Was it the representative user or something? What was the word?
Yeah, you could use like a user or participant profile, a representative experience.
Right. So that's what we're trying to drive towards as we look at that qualitative data, is that representative experience. So if you're going through 20 different sets of, or 20 interview data pieces, you're kind of looking at what's representative through those. So you're trying to get at the truth that underlies the common experience, the shared experience of the individuals. And I think the way you ended, which is a really good point, is this idea of we have to constantly remember that it's the user we're looking at. It's not my company's experience that we're trying to figure out, it's the end user's experience. So in the case of UMKC, it's not UMKC per se that I care about, it's what my students at UMKC care about. And when we get to that point of that representative experience, we have the raw materials to define what the problem actually is, right? So that's the tangible outcome of the analysis process. And when we talk about definition, what we're really trying to talk about is breaking down whatever a problem is. And in social services and nonprofit work, in government work, oftentimes in for-profit work too, but let's just stick to nonprofit right now. What we're oftentimes talking about are complex problems, right? Poverty, education, housing. These are complex issues. What we're trying to break down through the approaches Monica was talking about, trying to get at the core of, is what is a shared experience that we can then make actionable into a problem statement that we can solve. And when we're piecing this puzzle together, and you get to kind of feel like a detective as you go through this process, or an investigator, or if you're a Sherlock Holmes fan or Nancy Drew, you can play out that childhood fantasy of yours. But that's what we're really doing, right? We're investigating and trying to piece something together. And in academic terms, we would say making a hypothesis. In real terms, you're just really trying to develop a question that you can answer through some different solutions. And what we want it to be, though, is this: we're going to have a bit of a Goldilocks problem. You see my oatmeal there down there at the bottom. We don't want it to be too narrow or too broad. We want it to be just right. Now, there are a couple of things there is one way to know that you've written a bad problem statement right off the bat, is if your solution is in your problem statement, like, we need more money, then that's not really a good problem statement, because you've written into it your solution already, right? But what you're really looking to do here is, you don't want to be too narrow. And I'm giving you, I wrote a couple just generic sample problem statements so you can kind of compare and contrast across the three of them here. So customers need 15 conversions before signing a contract, right? Too narrow, right? We already have the metric in there. This is not writing goal statements. We're trying to define a problem. Very, very narrow, way too narrow. Too broad would be customers do not know what they want. Okay, that may be true, but there's not enough there, right? We want to break it down into three parts. We're going to have the user, and both of the first two have a user. We're going to have a pain point, and we're going to have an insight. The too narrow doesn't have an insight. The too broad doesn't really have a pain point, right? So what if we get to the just right? Customers have a difficult time assessing a vendor value, right? There's our pain point. Creating a lengthy cultivation process, right? And so what through a series of interviews, this is actually something I did with a for-profit company. But what we found with that just right problem statement, the insight was this process keeps going on and on and on. And why? Because the pain point the customer had is there was, in economic terms, asymmetry of information. right? The customer didn't have a good way of evaluating whether a vendor was offering something that was good or something that was not good. And so now we have a problem statement that has a sufficient enough of detail, but isn't so detailed that it's written in the 15 conversions or conversations before signing a contract. Because if we look at the too narrow one, what that would lead us to do from a solutions perspective is we would just go have 15 conversations and then we solve the problem. Maybe, but are they the right conversations? Like, why do we need to have 15 conversations? And the just right one kind of talks to that. What we really need to do is help our customers assess the value of what we're doing. And if we can do that quicker, then we will also shorten the cultivation process. Okay? So, I lost my question slide. So that's really where we want to go with problem statement and data. And the point here is we have to do the detailed research and analysis work so that we can actually get to a problem that we can define comfortably, right? A problem that allows us to get to the most possible solutions. And that's the other point with the problem statement. You want one that has as many possible solutions that you, as the opportunity to create the most possible solutions. The other thing I will say, Monica talked very early on about bias. The reason I want to talk, one of the ways you know whether you have bias or not, and a kind of a little trick I've learned along the way, is before you even get into the analysis, have everybody who's on the planning team or on the team that's working through this process to write out what they think the right solution should be. Before you've even done interviews, before you've done analysis, before you've done problem statement analysis. And you keep it on kind of like what some facilitators call a parking lot board. And you put it to the side. And if in your problem statement, one of those things pops up, you know you've gone too narrow and you know your bias is creeping in. Check yourself, put barriers up on yourself so that you can kind of control against some of those things happening to you, right? So, you know, that way you can be honest throughout this entire process. It doesn't mean those things won't come back in. Of course they could come back in, but we don't want them to come in before it's too early for them to come in. Does that make sense? All right, so let's do this. Let us go through now, and this is our period of time before we go to breakouts where we like to do a Q&A. Cindy has put up the Qualtrex survey again. I took the slides down, Phils. I can put them back up if you guys need me to. They are available in Box. Mark will repost that link for people if they want it. But this is the time. Any questions, comments, thoughts, clarifications necessary?
Scott, I'll just add to one thing you said while we're waiting for people to type in their questions. So when you mentioned the parking lot, so when a group of people is coming up at the beginning with all of their potential biases and maybe they feel like they already have some of the solutions in their mind that could possibly be there, I think this is a good way also for people to get some of their like nerves out, because if you're coming into a situation and you're feeling like, okay, this is where I'm coming from and this is what I'm thinking, if everybody puts that all out there, a lot of those things will be shared across people and you can say, okay, like this is kind of like what we're thinking. It's okay, like we're just gonna like put that out there so that we can move past it and we can really then as collectively as a group look at things in a more objective way. I think also it's an interesting way if you do put it in a parking lot or something like that, then you can come back to that. Oftentimes those things won't even apply after you've gone through the interview research, and I think it really produces that buy-in that we've talked about too, of like, oh, this process is really beneficial because inevitably you're going to find things in the data and through the process that you can't think of ahead of time. So it's going to prove that there is value in it.
So there's a question that just popped up. Cindy, do you want to read it and then while I think of an answer?
Yes. Thank you, Namisha. Let's say you have a problem statement. Would you want to go to the representative stakeholder group to gather your views, feedback on the problem statement? Would they be part of the verification process?
Yeah, so great question. The answer is it depends, right? So don't get stuck on process from from the perspective of if you don't do this step, or if you do this step, then you're doing it the right or the wrong way. Let me say that I've done it both ways. If time allows, absolutely, Namisha. If time allows for you to take your problem statement to the audience to verify that you are addressing their needs, is this something that's really a pain point for you? Is this accurately describe your situation? I think that's great. However, it's not necessary, because even when we get to solutions, which we will, and we start prototyping, we're going to go back to that group to see if we have successfully begun to solve their problem. So there's multiple checks in the process. I do like this approach when time allows, like I said, but if it doesn't allow, it's okay, because we're going to come back to them also.
Either one of you on this one. So what, can you offer some approaches for a small organization with one full-time staff, you know, and some event facilitators and volunteer board, from Susanna Brunn at Gilda?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So you don't need to have a team. We mention that a lot because it's valuable to incorporate other people's opinions and viewpoints. Everyone may have a different perspective. You can do this with volunteers. You can do this with people that you're just asking for their opinion too, but it's completely okay to do this type of work independently as well. A lot of people who do all types of qualitative research do this independently. As long as you have systems in place so that you can really like check yourself, you can go back and make sure you're being transparent even with yourself and your process. I think that that's important. But you can, with a small organization, you can definitely incorporate people that might be interesting voices to be a part of at least parts of the process, and then you can certainly do the overarching process yourself.
And let me add one other point to that, which is my end goal for anyone is that we don't just practice design thinking when we need it, that we take this approach, this empathetic approach, into how we manage. And so the reason I bring that up as it relates to that specific question is, think about when you're doing development work. If your development approach was every time I'm having a conversation, even an entry conversation with someone, first time I've ever met them, I'm taking this approach of story collection, of empathetic listening. And then I'm constantly in the process of trying to draw connections between that meeting and another meeting I have. Then this becomes a part of how you do business, of how you conduct your day-to-day operations, that it doesn't have to be a standalone, let's get 10 people together to go through a design process. And from my perspective, a better approach is that this becomes your strategic orientation to how you run your organizations. And that we're not asking you to do new work, whereas what we're saying is that this may be a way that you can evolve your existing engagements with people and clients. And so if you are at something like Gilda's Club, like as you're sitting and observing and listening and being a part of those conversations, is there a way I can incorporate this approach into it that I've now added to my toolkit so that I'm constantly iterating problem solving for people for continuous improvement purposes?
Scott, we've got one from Colette Black. As far as when you're asked by funders, especially in a grant proposal, when you're kind of limited on those, 300 words or less, is there some advice on how to
Great question.
best fit, a crisp, concise problem statement?
Yeah, great question, Colette. And I will tell you that when it comes to funders, I give them what they want, right? This is more of an internally driven process to make sure that you're meeting the needs of your clients. You may be better served with writing a crisp problem statement for a grant or a funder that they can understand and is measurable for them. This is the difference between a mission statement and a kind of a tagline, right? Taglines are oftentimes we put out there for people so they just kind of know us. A mission statement serves that purpose, but serves a broader purpose internally also for us. So, a great question. I would give the funder what they want, which is probably something that's crisper and cleaner and along those lines.
And also, Scott, I was wondering, maybe more toward Monica, is there one of the techniques that you would recommend to try to say, here's a program I'm trying to develop, I need a 300-word problem statement? Which of these techniques would you go after to try to firm that up?
I think too, it's also how much have you already done? Like, so if you're in an organization and you already have a lot of information that you've gathered, if you already have a lot of research, then it may just be something where you need to talk to a particular group of people because you might be trying to develop a particular type of program or something that's really more specific or an add-on to something, and it's really going to address a particular group who will be receiving it. So it might be something where you just need to do a little bit of like supplemental interviewing or observations. Just like, let's say you needed to go out and follow a particular route of services or something like that, and just look for or observe any pain points. So that might be something that you could just supplement. If you're starting from scratch and you're building something brand new, then it might be you need to do some interviews, you need to do those observations as well. It might be a little bit more in depth. But as far as one of the techniques, I think that they are fluid. I think that you don't have to put yourself into like one or the other. I think you can look at what your problem is and then kind of say, okay, I think like this might help me get the information that I need. I'm going to use, I'm going to do some interviews to try to get at that. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, great.
So Monica, I'm actually going to take did you already set up the breakout rooms?
Yeah,
okay,
I can do that now.
Okay, well, while you do that, there is a question that's probably directed towards you, which is, do you have a preferred formula of what information should be covered in a user persona?
Yeah, so I think as far as the user persona goes, you really want to get to the person's experiences of how they walk through their day-to-day life. So whatever that might mean, it might mean where are they living, who are they living with, just generally speaking. What types of work or social groups are they a part of? Do they have family members? Are they supporting those family members? And if so, how are they doing that? And what does that look like? What are they balancing? What are they juggling? So there's no real formula, unfortunately, because humans are so different and every situation is going to be so different. But I think if you can go into it with that open mind of everybody is different, here are kind of some of the core things that are a little bit more universal and also going to get at what we're trying to know. You really want to think about what are we trying to learn about this community of people or the people who will be receiving a product or a service, and try to think about what their day-to-day might look like and then learn about that.
I will post an example of what a profile write-up can be on someone. The other thing I will say that's good about this is you don't need 100 stories. You don't need 100 interviews. 10 to 20 is sufficient to get you going, to be honest with you. This is not where you need to have mounds and mounds of interviews. And to Monica's point, you want to try and get people across the entire spectrum. The product, as you all know, because you've been on these before, what we like to do is give you a little time to just network and talk with each other. We've shifted more recently to the community rooms not being about a specific question, but giving you the opportunity to just kind of check in with each other about what's going on in your world. That seems to be working a little better.